رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه أما بعد. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So yesterday we looked at Surah An-Nazi'at, and in particular we talked about the role of the angels and the spiritual presence and importance of belief in the angels and recognition of what their role is for our faith and for our life as a Muslim. The importance is for us to recognize that we're not just subject to physical and material and predictable types of influences in our life. Those things, because the effect is very close, we appreciate it. But there are certain things that we have to think about. If you have small children, then you've probably experienced the fact that if the consequence for a good or a bad deed is removed from the action, the child will not be able to make an association between what they did and what the consequence is. So if they do a good deed, and then the next day you say, yesterday I like what you did, here is a prize. They might remember, but the association will be too loose, too far apart for it to be meaningful. Or if you punish them for something that they did which was wrong or which was dangerous, but a week later, they're not going to remember, and if they remember, they're not going to be able to make the association. It won't influence their behavior effectively in the future. Many of us, even as adults, spiritually, we still operate as children. And so we think that those things that affect our life on a physical level, those effects are real. Those causes are real. But the spiritual effects, which we need to contemplate, which we need to think about, which might take time to show up because they're gradual, or in some cases because they might not be in this world, they might show up at the end of our life or in the hereafter, we think that they are not real. And that requires intellectual and spiritual presence of mind. Because in many cases, those effects which are gradual and those effects which are far apart are much more important and much more real than those that are immediate. At most, they might last for a brief time or they might last for the rest of our life. So that was just a reminder and a summary of what we spoke about yesterday. Today, I would like to look at the next surah of the Quran, and this is Surah Abasa wa Tawalla. Surah Abasa. What does Surah Abasa mean? Abasa is a verb in Arabic and it means to frown. That is where the name Abbas comes from as well. Abbas refers not to frowning though as in manner of bad etiquette, but to a lion, which is an animal that is kind of symbolized as representing strength and power and courage, and it's derived from a word that originally means to frown. But in Surah Abasa wa Tawalla, it appears that the frowning is in a negative connotation. And this has brought that controversy in the Muslim world as to who these verses are referring to. Because the Quran says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Abasa wa Tawalla an ja'ahu al-a'ma, wa ma yudrika لعله يزكى أو يذكر فتنفعه الذكرى. The Quran doesn't mention who it's referring to. He turned away and frowned, or he frowned and turned away. That a blind person came to him. And what do you know? Maybe that blind person is seeking to become pious, to purify himself, or he will remember, and that remembrance will benefit that person. This is a criticism of a particular type of behavior. It's a critique of a frowning in the face of a blind person, which the Quran contrasts with وَأَمَّا مَنْ جَاءَكَ يَسْعَى وَأَمَّا مَنِ اسْتَغْنَى فَأَنْتَ لَهُ tasadda. That if there is somebody who thinks that they don't have any material need, they feel rich, and the Quran doesn't say that they are rich. Man istaghna. Because antumul fuqara, all of us are poor. Even the billionaire, even the most wealthy, powerful person, they are just as poor, and in many cases more poor, than those who might not have all of their physical and material needs met. Best case scenario is they're equally poor. But worst case scenario is that if they become arrogant, then they're even further away from God's mercy and away from salvation than somebody who might have nothing in this world. That's why our ahadith tell us that إِيَّاكَ وَظُلْمَ مَنْ لَا يَجِدُ عَلَيْكَ نَاصِرًا إِلَّا اللَّهِ. If you want to oppress somebody, if you want to pick a fight with somebody, then pick a fight with somebody strong. Pick a fight with somebody powerful. At the most, they'll get back at you. You pick a fight with somebody who is twice your strength, they'll beat you up. You'll get a bloody nose, you'll get a broken bone, you'll go to the hospital. You pick a fight with somebody who has a better attorney than you do and more political connections, then they'll make your life a living hell. That's the worst they can do. But if there's somebody who لَا يَجِدُ عَلَيْكَ نَاصِرًا إِلَّا اللَّهِ, they know they have nobody but God, then they're not going to reach for their gun, they're not going to reach for their phone and call their lawyer, they're not going to call their political connections. Who are they going to call? Allah. And if somebody calls on Allah against you, then there is nothing that you can do in this world or the hereafter to save yourself. If your opponent and the representative of your opponent is Allah. Now, Allah is not exclusively for those who have no other support. The difference is that the rich often don't think to call Allah because they think they have other means. Otherwise, if a person is wealthy, powerful, politically connected, and they call on Allah, Allah is just as present for that person as He is for the poor. It's that there is a distraction. So that's why the best case scenario is that the rich person knows that and recognizes that they are in need of Allah. But a poor person is more likely to be able to make that realization. Not that they have any closer connection to Allah than anybody else. So, the istighna is a false impression. Amma man istaghna, amma man ja'aka, that a person comes to you and they think that they are wealthy. وَأَمَّا مَنِ اسْتَغْنَى فَأَنْتَ لَهُ تَصَدَّى. This person you want to give attention to. So the Quran is drawing a contrast. Now, the question is, who is the Quran speaking about and who is the Quran speaking to? Majority of Sunni Mufassirin say that this is referring to the Prophet. And when I say majority, that is the consensus opinion within the Sunni world. Abasa wa tawalla, the Prophet was in Mecca. He wanted to preach Islam. This is before Islam had spread far and wide. And he was speaking to some of the prominent members of Quraysh when a blind person comes and wants to spend some time with the Prophet. And the blind person is not always able to know what is going on. They can't see physically with their eyes who the Prophet is facing and who he's talking to. All they can do is they can feel things and they can hear things. And so the Prophet, because he wanted to try to get the message to those powerful people, he ignored the blind person, according to this tafsir. And because the Prophet ignored him, Allah criticized and said that Abasa wa tawalla, you frowned and you turned away, that this blind person has come to you, and maybe he is the one who is actually going to be receptive to your message. Then a person comes to you who doesn't feel to have any need. If they are listening to your message, then maybe it's just a matter of courtesy, maybe it's a formality, maybe because the Prophet is from Quraysh and they want to maintain some kind of superficial, formal relationship, or even worse, maybe they want to then use that courtesy in order to extract favors from the Prophet in the future. Not every acceptance of an invitation is something that is done sincerely. And so the Prophet is told, according to this interpretation, according to this understanding, that that person is mustaghni. They don't consider themselves to be in need of your preaching, your teaching. This is the person that you pay attention to. Now, the problem with that is that why would Allah send a prophet if he had not yet perfected his akhlaq? Nowadays in the corporate world and in the software world, we have that tendency to get the product out the door as soon as possible. And we'll fix the bugs after it's already been used, and our consumers will suffer when they're trying to do their work and their business, and they might lose their files, they might have to spend a lot of time with technical support on the phone, and they will correct our work so that in the future it will be better than it was in the past. That's a very modern kind of a conception, and all of us have probably experienced its frustrations at one time or another. And sometimes it's not just a frustration, it can be dangerous. Did Allah fire his research and development team, his troubleshooting team, and so he said that, well, let me send the Prophet, and this will be the beta version of the Prophet. And then he will do things here and there, and we'll find out, no, this is not good akhlaq. Then we'll tell the Prophet, no, why don't you correct this, and why don't you correct this, and maybe, is that a problem that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had? Or did Allah have the ability and have the wisdom and the knowledge and the power to send a prophet who was a role model? Well, Allah rationally, we know, did not have any limitations. He didn't test, He didn't make a mistake. And then the Quran itself says that Allah gave the Prophet the best akhlaq, that he is an uswa for all of humanity, that he is a person whose character and practice was a role model from the moment he was made a prophet. That is why he was made a prophet. If I were to do this, then I would expect many of you would become upset with me, and some of you would probably say that I'm not going to pray behind that Maulana again, because he doesn't have respect for people who are seeking guidance, and he's just after money, or he's just after people who are powerful. Many of us, that's not even character that we would expect from a prophet. That's just character that we would expect from an alim or a normal Muslim among our friends. Our own family members, if they have this kind of superficial etiquette, then we don't consider them to be pious or mutakhalliq or spiritual people. So how can somebody who is ala khuluqin azim make that kind of a mistake? Now, some of you who know the tafsir of this surah probably assume that what I'm going to move towards is the majority Shia opinion, which is that these verses are not addressing the Prophet. And that's not where I'm going. Because so far, what we have established is that the superficial impression that we get from these verses cannot be accurate. But then, if we say that it's referring to, and I'm not going to mention who it is, although we might have some voices from the audience who suspect and who might wish to say, but we will simply say, according to the hadith of Imam Muhammad Baqir alayhi salatu wassalam, Rajulun min Bani Umayyah, one of the people from Banu Umayyah. And the figure that you have in your mind is a member of Banu Umayyah. So Imam Baqir says simply, Rajulun min Banu Umayyah. It was a man from Banu Umayyah who had that character. And what happened is that he was with the Prophet, and then Ibn Maktoum, the blind companion of the Prophet, who also was given an honor by the Prophet to be a mu'adhin, he came. And it was that Rajul min Bani Umayyah who was a little bit upset and offended and said that, why is the Prophet spending time with that person? He's blind, he's not from an important tribe, he should be paying attention to me. Because Banu Umayyah, after Banu Hashim, that was the most noble or widely respected family of Quraysh, and by extension of all of Arabia. So this hadith says that the actual arrogance was on the part of that Rajul min Bani Umayyah. But there is a problem. That also superficially runs into a problem. Let me read the verses again, and then let's see if this is the way that the Quran addresses people. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Abasa wa tawalla, he frowned and he turned away. And ja'ahu al-a'ma, that a blind person came to him. وَمَا يُدْرِيكَ لَعَلَّهُ يَزَّكَّى. And what do you know that maybe that person is seeking to purify himself? أَوْ يَذَّكَّرُ فَتَنْفَعَهُ الذِّكْرَى. Or that person will remember and take heed, and that remembrance will benefit that person. Would the Quran ever address Rajul min Bani Umayyah directly? The Quran does not do that. When it's addressing the kuffar, or the mushrikeen, or the munafiqeen, they're not worthy of being addressed directly by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His revelation. The Prophet is told to give them a message. But the Jews are not addressed directly in the Quranic revelation. The munafiqeen are not addressed directly in the Quranic revelation. The kuffar are not addressed directly in the Quranic revelation. The person who is so weak in faith that they have this kind of a character, that person would not be addressed directly in the Quranic revelation. This is not something that we find in the Quran. Now, if we don't find it somewhere else in the Quran, people might say, well, this is the one example. It's theoretically possible, but there is a way that the Quran speaks. When it addresses to the believers, there is a phrase, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu. When there is a care or a concern about one particular person, like in Surah Al-Mujadala or in other surahs, then the Prophet is addressed to convey a message to that one particular person. And so this is not the method of the Quran. So the problem with saying that these verses refer to the Prophet is what? That the Prophet did not have that kind of akhlaq, that kind of character, that he would make that mistake. The problem with saying that this is referring to Rajul min Bani Umayyah is that, why would Rajul min Bani Umayyah be referred to by the Quran? Why would Allah address him directly without saying, Qul, Ya ayyuhal Rasul, or Ya ayyuhal Nabi, or Qul, that this person should take care of their character. So now what is the solution? Solution is to think back to the practice that sometimes existed in extended families, sometimes in noble families. There was a concept in the time of royal families where a prince could not be punished, because a prince is being trained to take charge of an entire kingdom or a government. And if you scold, punish that prince, the effect on that personality is going to be a negative effect. This is something that Islam gives importance to in general. With our children, sometimes we think that they're our property, we can scold them. And Islam says that you are not to scold, you are not to use physical or corporal punishment, unless very selectively, but not in a way to break the personality, to kind of destroy the confidence and the personality of that child or of another human being. That's a very important principle for all of our relationships, in particular if your child is named Muhammad or your child is named Fatima. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. We're told that in that case then, don't ever even speak ill of them, don't scold them, don't yell at them. I remember that there was one new parent who heard that hadith and said that, thank God I found this out before I named my children. I'm not going to name my son Muhammad now, because if I were to do that, then I'd have to be careful and worry about what I were going to say to that person. And that's true. The reason is that if you name your child Muhammad, if you name your daughter Zahra, or name her after Fatima Zahra, then you're dedicating that child to that personality. When people are going to hear the word Muhammad, they're going to think of your child and they're going to think of the Prophet. When they hear the word Fatima, they're going to hear the name of your child and they're going to think of the person that she was named after. Both of those associations will be there whenever one of the associations is spoken of or intended. You don't want somebody to have that name and to have a broken or damaged personality, to have been subjected to any kind of upbringing that will discourage them from being confident, being generous, being open-minded, being sincere and pious. And scolding, it causes that harm. So it's not that, well, only those children who have the name of the Prophet and Lady Fatima, they're safe. But it's even more important for them, because every child deserves that honor. But if the child is named after a ma'asum, then it's not just that they deserve it, but also because of the importance of that name and that association. You don't want to see anybody with the name Muhammad or with the name Fatima dishonoring the person that they were named after. It becomes more important. So what did they do in the olden days with princes? They had a whipping boy. The scolding would come to somebody else, that person would be yelled at, that person would be punished, and the prince would just watch. And that would sometimes make the prince a little bit arrogant, but it would also indirectly be a message that this was a very bad thing. You deserve to be punished, but because you're a prince, we're not going to punish you directly, we're going to punish somebody else. Now, the social reason for that was to keep the honor and the dignity of the prince, but also to say that this was something that was very wrong. There's no justification of that kind of a practice from Islam, because it would be against the Quranic logic, لَا تَزِرُ وَازِرَةٌ وِزْرَ أُخْرَى, and it also would create many harms in the prince's personality, many more severe harms than that minor benefit of not destroying or breaking their personality. But that is a principle that has a certain wisdom, even if it's not Islamic. The wisdom was that sometimes if you say something directly, it doesn't have the intended effect. It can have the opposite effect. It can create a backlash. People will not always appreciate it, or they will begin to justify it. If you come and tell me, if I have, for example, the tendency to be very stubborn, if you come and tell me you're stubborn, then right there you will see an example of my stubbornness, because I will say that no, that's not the case at all. But if you come and complain to me about somebody else who's stubborn, and then mention some of the signs of stubbornness, and maybe some of the solutions, that if only that person were able to think about things and count to 10 before they respond, or give some techniques, not that you're telling me, but you're telling somebody else. If I don't suspect that you're talking to me, I might actually listen. And I might actually try some of them. I might not, but there is a better chance that I will listen than if it comes directly. So that wisdom does apply in Islam. And Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam says that the Quran does that. But unlike the whipping boy, where the prince at a higher status has somebody of a lower status who is going to take the punishment and bear the brunt, the Quran does something in reverse. It says that the Prophet who has a higher status, the highest status, will be addressed for a moral message that the Prophet does not need to hear, and where he did nothing wrong, so that the Muslims can understand that that is the ideal of Islamic character that they are to aspire to. It was the Muslims who were lacking in their practice, not the Prophet. But the solution is conveyed in a way so that it's addressed to the Prophet, and the Muslims are listening as if they are not the guilty party, in the hope that maybe they won't become arrogant and they will learn and they will listen. So does that solve our problem? It does. Because the solution then is that the words are addressed to the Prophet for an act that the Prophet did not do anything wrong in. But the Prophet was given a message to correct the behavior of another person. So, Abasa wa tawalla an ja'ahu al-a'ma, it was revealed to the Prophet. And there's nothing wrong with saying that the words are addressing the Prophet, but we cannot say that the underlying mistake was a mistake made by the Prophet. Now let me give you some further detail. If that incident is true, then when the Prophet was speaking to those prominent people of Quraysh, even a blind person should be able to hear that the Prophet is talking. Even if they don't know whether the Prophet is talking, then it is etiquette when you come to somebody who is at a higher status to ask if they have time and how much time they have. I can't come to somebody who is senior, who is a person that deserves my respect, and then make a demand on their time. Ask one question, and then a follow-up, and then a follow-up, and then a follow-up. That is their gift and their grace that they are giving me, that I don't know what all of their other responsibilities are. I might think that my question is the most important question in the whole world. So if that incident is true, then it was that blind person who came who made the mistake of placing a demand on the time of the Prophet that may not have been in accordance with what the Prophet had already begun or whom he was speaking to. And if the Prophet were to say, wait a minute, or if the Prophet were to say that I will attend to you or answer your question in a moment, then that would not be against akhlaq, it would simply be a matter of justice or fairness. People don't need to be put down because they are wealthy. If you're speaking to somebody already and you are having a conversation with them, doesn't mean that they need to be insulted and somebody else who is poor or somebody who is blind needs to be put on a pedestal if it is fair and it is just. So that principle that the Prophet is speaking of is a matter of justice and is a matter of fairness. And then it applies to the blind person, that person should have maintained etiquette and waited. Now, the Quran may have used that incident in which the Prophet did nothing wrong to pretend that there was a mistake that was made on the part of the Prophet in order to give a lesson to the Muslims. There may have been two different incidents, or it may have been that same incident where that person came and the Prophet turned away from the blind person for a justified reason, and that Rajul min Bani Umayyah turned away out of arrogance, and so this verse was revealed to clarify that point. So if that explanation is clear, then in summary, we shouldn't say that this verse was not revealed about the Prophet. It was revealed to the Prophet, it addresses the Prophet, it was revealed about the Prophet, but not about the Prophet's character. It was revealed to the Prophet and about the Prophet in order to explain to him what are the problems that the members of his ummah will have, the types of discrimination that they might fall prey to, and that they need to be on guard against. So that was all we had time for today. There are some other important verses in this surah, and so we will briefly address those other verses inshallah, and then we will move on to Surah At-Takwir. Let us conclude by reciting a Surah Fatiha for the sponsors of tonight's program, for all the marhumin of your family, and for all other marhumin and marhumat, in particular the shuhada of Islam. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahmanir Rahim, Maliki Yawmiddin. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين